Welcome to week 3 of PsychMed's current podcast series, part of the Gambling Harm Awareness Month, focused on discussing harms associated with gambling and video gaming. My name is Queely, and I'm a clinical psychologist currently practicing at PsychMed. Today, we'll be hearing from 3 valuable contributors in the field of assessment and treatment of gaming and the intersection between gaming and gambling: Quinton Black, Patrick Kerry, and Paul Del Fabro. They have all graciously agreed to speak to us today, and I'm sure we'll learn a lot. Patrick and Quinton work at PsychMed and are my colleagues, and Paul is a professor at Adelaide University. All 3 speakers are affiliated with the Wellbeing and Recovery Research Institute. Now welcome Dr. Quinton Black. Dr. Black is a medical practitioner, clinical psychologist, educator and researcher, and is currently the program director of PsychMed. Dr. Black has worked for 38 years in multiple clinical roles. He's overseen multiple programs for problem gamblers in South Australia since the early 1990s. He's a senior clinical lecturer in psychiatry in the School of Medicine at the University of Adelaide and a senior clinical lecturer in psychology in the School of Psychology, Society and Justice at the University of South Australia. Quinton, I now welcome you to talk to us about the experiences of 2 clients of yours who had been referred for problem gambling and other comorbid difficulties, and to discuss what their pathway to recovery looked like.
So the first person I'd like to talk about, Quee, is a young man I met when he was 17, JC for this purpose, and he was referred following a series of 2 or 3 suicide attempts in near succession, following the breakdown of a relationship with his live-in girlfriend. Now, at the time of referral, he had dependence on nicotine, cannabis, methamphetamines, hallucinogens. He was regularly using oral psychostimulants also, such as ecstasy and MDMA. And his assessment and referral sort of indicated polysubstance misuse, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. In addition, he was spending up to 16 to 18 hours per day, most days of the week, playing on the internet and gaming. And he was engaged in multiple forms of internet group gaming and had originally, in the lead up, been involved in a range of activities on the internet, including socialising, doing his studies or entertainment and things, but it had become increasingly focused around gaming and his role as a captain in multiplayer live games on the net. He had increased his hours over time, and he had experienced symptoms of withdrawal when he tried to limit his gaming hours. He'd been really engaging in increasing gaming over the previous 10 years. And he had decreasing social attachments with both his family. He'd moved away from his family in rural South Australia to come to Adelaide with his girlfriend. And he'd also been engaged in increasing drug and alcohol use. So JC had a range of pressing issues, as we can see. From a therapeutic point of view, the most important reason for his referral was his recent suicide attempts. And so my therapeutic goals that were established with JC tended to focus not so much on his internet gaming, but more on treatment of his depression using cognitive behavioural therapy, and also focusing on some of his drug use that was more harmful and dangerous than other drug use. So we tended to use a harm minimisation psychoeducation approach to help him make decisions and set some goals around his engagement with illicit drugs and also legal drugs such as nicotine and alcohol. And the focus from a therapeutic perspective was not so much on trying to immediately modify his gaming behaviour, but more about enhancing his capacity to cope with the various stressors in his life and focusing on issues relating to self-efficacy, so building some confidence in his capacity to cope with these experiences. So I've been seeing him for over a period of time. Initially, he was coming in fortnightly for about 6 months. We tailed that back, and he did progressively set more goals for himself, and he maintained contact with PsychMed in our methamphetamine treatment program over a period of 2 years. He also came in and continued to set goals which were increasingly pro-social and about his re-engagement in life. So where is he now? 5 years on from when I first met JC, he progressively engaged in more pro-social behaviours, which had the effect of decreasing his engagement with gaming over time. He actually stopped using some of the dangerous psychostimulants and hallucinogens he was engaged in initially. Now he actually has set goals around abstaining from all illicit drugs. The last one he tackled was cannabis, and he's been abstinent now for over 18 months. He also quit nicotine and alcohol use, and has adopted a very kind of pro-social lifestyle where he engages in regular exercise. He's now re-engaged with a new partner and literally become engaged to be married. He has a full-time job now, and in fact, we had set goals that he was going to, in his words, sort of game for the right reason. So he was using gaming as a recreational hobby rather than a coping strategy. And in fact, he at our last contact, he told me that he hadn't gamed at all for the last 6 months, and that in fact he cut down to 2 hours on a weekend as one of his goals, and then he just sort of decided that he didn't really need that in his life anymore at the moment. So, but it was very difficult earlier on. When he tried to initially limit his gaming, he felt a lot of sense of guilt and responsibility around his teams, that he was involved with the multiplayer gaming, and so this was kind of a major barrier initially. So that's JC. The next person I wanted to talk about was SM. SM was an interesting young man who was referred to me again following a suicide attempt when his parents had withdrawn his access to the internet in an attempt to try and limit his gaming. He was still attending school. He was 14 years old when he was first referred, and he had a diagnosis of ASD, autism. So his parents were very concerned about his amount of time that he spent on the net. He would come home from school and go immediately onto the internet and engage in gaming and other activities. In fairness, one of the issues was that he was doing his homework and his entertainment and his socialisation and a range of different things on the internet, but his parents perceived that this was all really one negative component in his life. So their approach had been to try and restrict and limit, and this had an effect to sort of decreasing his autonomy to the point where he attempted suicide. Another factor in his suicide attempt had been, for many years, his father had allowed him to take small amounts of money and change that had been left over, and he had been engaging in investing money in his games and buying and purchasing skins and playing on third-party sites with loot boxes, and to the point where he'd actually taken money off his father's credit card, and at one stage had spent around $15,000 in one case. And then when the parents discovered that, it led to a lot of recriminations within the family. He promised that would never happen again and all of these sorts of things. And then, of course, 3 or 4 months later, the same thing occurred. And so this was just prior to his suicide attempt. So, but that had been, on the basis of many years of sort of stealing small amounts of money, and to the point where he needed larger and larger amounts of money to satisfy that need. So therapeutic goals were really based around his suicidality initially and his depression. He experienced a lot of bullying and isolation at school. He was engaging in school refusals because of his ASD. He had a lot of difficulty fitting in the school environment and was singled out quite a bit. So this was one of the reasons he gravitated towards spending increasing amounts of time on the net. It was very difficult for his family as well. They made a lot of attempts to try and engage him in schools that had programs for assisting children with ASD, and they made a lot of attempts to work as a family around these things. But essentially, after the major theft and the attempts to sort of react to his access and limit his access, things sort of de-escalated quite significantly. So one of the key therapeutic goals beyond cognitive behavioural therapy for his depression was directed towards helping the family and working on interpersonal skills and communications and understanding of each other's perspective, and also looking at some of the solutions and some of the goals that the family had as well as SM had. So where's SM now? Well, he's survived. He's 18 years old now. He has been through a series of difficult relationships. He's also dabbled with cannabis for a period of time as part of his late adolescence and an attempt to sort of connect socially with other young adolescents. He's come through this kind of period. His parents have adopted a much less interventionist approach and have been much more supportive in him sort of developing his own goals and taking personal responsibility for his decisions, and they've been a bit more respectful of that. The family now is, he still lives with his parents. They are much closer now. He's working with his dad in his dad's small business. His father left his job to devote extra time to working with his son, and they have been, in terms of gaming, he really didn't have the same level of time as JC spent on gaming, but he did have a significant issue with spending money on third-party sites and gaming, and none of that occurs now. He's actually abstaining from alcohol, and that's a decision that he took, and as well as cannabis. And he's engaged in quite a pro-social lifestyle now, where he regularly engages in activities that are goal-centred and give him a sense of achievement and accomplishment in social activities that provide some respite and friendship and fun and pleasure. And he also has a regular exercise program that he engages in. So things have changed significantly for him. He's been in remission from depression for at least a year or so now, and now he's more focused on, vocational evaluation of, and future directions for himself. He has a new relationship at the moment, which seems to be going very well, and hopefully he'll continue along that path.
Now we'll hear from Professor Paul Del Fabro about the crossover of gambling and gaming. Paul graduated from the University of Adelaide with degrees in arts, commerce and economics, and a PhD in psychology. He has published extensively in several areas, including the psychology of gambling, child protection, child welfare, and applied cognition. He has over 350 publications in these areas, including over 250 national and international referee journal articles. He completed a PhD on the psychology of gambling in 1998 and has been a principal lecturer in learning and behaviour in the School of Psychology for 20 years at the University of Adelaide. He has published a number of papers on gaming machine features, been a witness in patent cases relating to gaming machine features, and has given multiple presentations on this topic over the last 25 years. He was an advisor to the Federal Productivity Commission, has overseen multiple prevalence studies, both for adults and adolescents in Australia, and has been a principal investigator in dozens of consultancies and grants over the last 20 years. Paul will talk to us today about the crossover of gambling and gaming, and whether new gambling-like products such as loot boxes are a potential source of harm, and the major forms of harms associated with excessive gaming and gambling.
Loot boxes are a topic which have emerged over the last 3 or 4 years. They represent what's called a form of monetization of gaming activities. So one of the things that's happened over the last few years is that increasingly gaming is becoming an activity which is including elements you otherwise would see in gambling. So if we think back to years gone by, and I can go back many years when it comes to gaming, gaming in the past was mainly arcade-based, and it was personal device-based in the home, where you would buy a game or a cartridge or a disc, and then you owned it. You pretty much, or you downloaded it in the last 10 years, and you owned it, and so you just played the game. Now, what's happened increasingly is that now games are now sort of broken up into different components, where you might get the game for free initially, or you might pay for a subscription to a game, and then you have to continually pay for additional things to stay engaged with that game over a longer period. And the more complex the game, the more people involved, the more likely you're going to have to pay for something to continue participation in that game. This is what's called monetization, and where we think it's a bit unethical, we often refer to it as predatory monetization, because you effectively get trapped into an activity where you don't really know the cost of it when you first sign up to the game. And once you're very engaged in the game, you want to continue paying the money to stay in. Now, loot boxes are one feature which fall into this category, that they're essentially an activity where you get a chest, or you have a set of cards where you, either through skill in the game or through paying for them directly, you get access to an outcome which is determined by chance, which delivers to you something that might be useful in the game, or some sort of aesthetic feature like a skin, which can change the look of your character. And concern has been raised because these look a little bit like gambling because of the chance-determined nature, and also the fact that you can, in an open economy system, you can take those skins and use them as a form of currency to gamble on third-party sites, or trade them on sort of virtual stock exchanges for other value. There's been some research. I think that the most of it's been done in the UK, although there's some studies that have been done in Australia as well. I think David Zendel's work in the UK is probably the most frequently cited, because he first started doing this work and has done several studies. What this essentially shows, if you do surveys of people who are engaged with gambling and gaming, you'll find that people who report using more loot boxes, or purchasing them, or using them a lot more, tend to score higher on measures of problem gambling. This has led to the view that maybe gambling is a form of crossover. Gaming can be a form of crossover activity which can lead you into gambling. My general view, having read the literature, is that it's probably not the case that playing loot boxes necessarily turns you into a gambler. There is some possibility that some people might gamble on loot boxes, then use those skins to gamble on other sites. It's much more likely the case that what's happening is that people who like gambling and gaming, so if you like gambling and you play games, which many people do, what they'll tend to do is gravitate towards the gambling-like features in the gaming. So if you're a person who's really likes gambling, but you also like playing games, and you suddenly encounter a game that's got this thing called a loot box, you'll probably like playing loot boxes and play lots of them. So it's unlikely the case that playing loot boxes turns you into a gambler. There's more evidence that loot boxes are simply a problem in their own right, and for gamers in general, irrespective of whether they engage in gambling. Gambling will be almost like a parallel activity. And there'll be cases coming in for treatment where you'll find there are people who've come into treatment largely because of problems associated with their gaming and spending too much on loot boxes. The evidence does suggest that most people don't spend a huge amount on loot boxes, but there are certainly cases indicating that there are people who spend a lot on them and can incur harm.
Paul, what is the current status of internet gaming disorder in the wider research community?
Internet gaming disorder is an interesting topic because, like many recently identified behavioural addictions, there's controversy about whether, in fact, it's a true form of addiction, and how does these so-called new forms of addiction differ from traditional addictions such as substance use, alcohol, drugs, and those sorts of things. Traditional addiction models tend to be based upon processes such as tolerance, withdrawal, cravings, those sorts of things. And research suggests there's some evidence of that occurring in gambling, but it's much more difficult to show that with gaming. And so one of the debates is that, is it really a form of addiction, which can be treated the same way, or is it something else? One of the arguments is for a compensatory model, arguing that, well, maybe it's simply a form of psychological coping. You've got other problems in your life, and you gravitate towards gaming as a form of escape. And so it's not necessarily that you're doing it to avoid withdrawal and those sorts of things, or to become more tolerant to it. It's simply a form of compensation for other things that are missing in your life. Another perspective that's increasingly emerging too, it's a form of habit. That is, the more you do something like this, it develops a certain inertia where you just have to keep on doing it, hitting a reward centers of your brain, and it becomes less and less about the goals you originally sought to obtain when you engage in the activity. It becomes more about just something you feel compelled to keep on doing. There's different lines of research out there, and I guess that also makes it a bit challenging to treat because some of the traditional models used to treat traditional addictions might not follow quite so, won't be applied quite so easily to these new forms of behaviour. So a lot of it might be more about, re-engaging people with other activities, which might otherwise provide, support for them, engage them, so that they feel less compelled to have to spend so much time engaged in gambling or gaming.
Now we'll hear from Patrick Kerry. Patrick is a provisional psychologist holding a Bachelor of Psychological Science in Honours and is currently completing a Master of Psychology in the clinical program at the University of Adelaide. Patrick has been practicing at PsychMed since 2018 and has assessed, treated and researched in areas of substance use disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicide intervention, depression and anxiety. He has presented at the Gambling Harm Conference, National Association of Gambling Studies Conference, and the Australia and New Zealand Addiction Conference. He's been involved in the assessment and treatment of internet gaming disorder at PsychMed and has recently completed his master's thesis, which examined the relationship between internet gaming disorder, self-reported harms, and engagement with gambling-like elements of video games. Patrick will talk to us today about the differential harm acquired by gamers and the different gambling-like elements within games.
And so we adapted this scale from its original 63 items to 57 items that changed it from a gambling focus, obviously, to a gaming focus. And it still had those same domains and that ability to attribute problems to gaming. And furthermore, what we decided to do as part of the thesis as an added hypothesis test was to see whether there were greater incidents of financial harm in gamers who were spending more on loot boxes, which Paul's been speaking about earlier, those gambling-like elements of gaming. So financial harm are things like missing certain bills, reducing expenditure on essential expenses, taking on additional employment, and even really severe harms like needing emergency accommodation or losing significant assets as a result of financial harm. And what we decided to do was examine whether loot box expenditure was associated with greater financial harms in general throughout one's life, as well as gaming-related, financial harm. So financial harm that the respondents identified as directly tied to their gaming behaviour. And so what we found was that across the board, IGD sufferers were much more likely to endorse experiences of harm across all different severities and domains. And interestingly, particularly differential in terms of physical health and psychological problems. They were much more likely to report that they had received psychological or physical harm from their gaming, and that moderate or greater gaming harm, which is a style of scoring method that we used, was endorsed almost 6 times higher in IGD gamers in psychological and physical harm categories than regular gamers who engage 3 or more days a week. Interestingly, in terms of loot boxes, we found that loot box expenditure was not significantly associated with harm in general. That is, the dollars spent on loot boxes over the past 3 months did not correlate significantly with the 13 financial harm items assessed in our questionnaire. But when we assessed for gaming-related financial harm, so financial harm that was somewhat or moderately tied to gaming, there was a significant positive association with loot box expenditure. So what our sample was telling us was that loot box expenditure was not positively associated with harm in general, but it was associated with harm specifically tied to gaming, which was quite interesting because this was not the case for other forms of gaming expenditure. So spending money on software or hardware or non-loot box microtransactions, for example, which, quite interestingly, were much higher in terms of average expenditure across the sample. So to use a sporting analogy, it's as if a sample of football players kind of revealed that tackling in a particularly risky style didn't predispose them to greater incidents of injury in their life in general, but there was a much greater incidence of injury on the footy field, I suppose, to use a tortured analogy. So if you were in our sample of about 500 gamers and you were engaging in loot boxes, with each dollar you spend, you're not more likely to miss a bill more, but if you do encounter some financial harm in your life, you're more likely to attribute that to your gaming behaviours. So it's a bit of a convoluted finding, particularly because our sample had particularly low loot box expenditure. I think it was about $2.80 on average, which probably indicates that with the 500 gamers we assessed in a cross-national sample, that loot box expenditure isn't that prevalent really compared to things like software where the average spend was about $40. over the last 3 months. But even with that small amount of expenditure across the sample, it was associated with gaming-related financial harm.
I think reflecting upon Patrick's findings is what he shows is that while gambling and gaming share many similarities, that is, you're looking for rewards, you're trying to earn points and advance your progress in the activities, there are clear differences in the types of harms that people experience. So with gambling, it's very much about financial harm. That's the number one harm people experience from gambling, and a lot of the other problems that flow from that are caused by the financial harms. But with gaming, as Patrick has shown, it's a little bit different. Financial harm, while it was correlated to some degree in some shape or form with some of these monetization features, the most common harm experience for gamers was more things like physical harm, psychological harm. In other words, losing sleep, eating the wrong food, not exercising, just neglecting your life through excessive time spent on the game. That seemed to be the major thing that was causing harm from gaming. Whereas with gambling, it's much more about the financial harms. That was an interesting finding. I think it was very important, I think, for Patrick to show that in his research.
Paul, how is harm measured in relation to gambling and gaming?
There's been a few recent attempts to try and capture the harms associated with gambling. I guess the longest list of harms and most detailed list that's been developed is the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation funded research conducted by Matt Brown and his team at Central Queensland University, which tried to capture all the different dimensions of harm that might be experienced by gamblers, ranging from psychological to physical health to financial, legal and various other areas. They had a series of binary scored items where they asked people, well, have you experienced this problem in a certain time period? And therefore they were able to work out what types of harm most commonly reported by gamblers. One of the potential problems with this is that some of the items they included in their harm scales were things like your savings are reduced, you're not spending as much time on other activities or other things, other leisure activities. And some people could argue, well, that's simply a substitution effect and not really a problem unless it's more severe. And many of these sort of behaviours might not necessarily always be due to the gambling. So what's been argued is the University of Sydney is probably better to try and capture the severity of these items in a bit more detail and to find out how much of it's actually due to gambling as opposed to other things. And these sorts of items, of course, can be adapted to gaming. And this is the research which Patrick Kerry has done at the University of Adelaide to look at whether the pattern of harms experienced by gamers who meet the clinical criteria is similar or different to what you observe in gamblers.
So thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, Patrick and Professor Del Fabro. I think that will help clarify how we're looking at these issues at the present for some of our gambling help workers and health professionals who are trying to understand how they should assess these issues and how they can proceed and what sort of help might be the most appropriate. Just tying it back into the examples that we talked about earlier, I would totally agree that with JC and SM, in both cases their amount of time that they were spending on gaming steadily increased over a period of years. And initially it was actually an activity that was very enjoyable, and in SM's case, as a young man with autism, I think it provided him with a way of communicating and socialising that wasn't as challenging as a school environment. So, do you have any sort of views about, certainly the approach that I kind of took really was not so much to focus as the parents had with SM on restriction and looking at that as the major issue. I mean, obviously the major issue at the time for SM was his suicide attempt, but also the breakdown in the family relationship. And so that became the therapeutic focus. Do you have any comments about that approach?
Yeah, along with Daniel King, who led this work, and we did a book recently called Internet Gaming Disorder, and which draws upon a lot of Daniel King's, I guess, observations and study of the clinical side of internet gaming disorder. But I think the thing that Dan would certainly say is that, at least the research certainly shows, is just taking away young people's technology as a punishment, particularly for tracked periods, is usually not a very good strategy. It can often lead to very violent reactions, and particularly if you've got a young person who's got ASD or developmental disorders of that nature, often they do rely upon that technology as a form of coping. It's often much of their life revolves around that technology. It's their way of engaging socially with other young people, often where they can't do that very effectively in school environments. And so to take away the technology takes away also the benefits as much as the cause of the problems. So it's more about the management of and sensible use of the technology and finding ways in which they can use it more constructively. So maintaining the social context, maintaining their engagement where it seems to be purposeful and giving them something useful in their life, but trying to reduce opportunities for the behaviour to cause harm. And that would, for example, would be playing games throughout the night, or playing games where the young person should be engaged with other activities or other commitments, where they're neglecting things at the expense of to game. And so I think managing the time and using gaming as a reward, for example, will be a productive strategy to apply. And so, but simply not taking it away altogether is not a good idea.
So from a therapeutic perspective too, I think that's really important, isn't it, to acknowledge that there are some functional and adaptive and useful aspects of gaming, although it may develop into a more maladaptive kind of coping when it interferes with other really constructive things like education and socialisation.
Well, one of the big challenges, in fact, with internet gaming disorder is that trying to work out what items capture the disorder is very difficult. We've seen so many scales which include items which almost look like healthy engagement. So, asking a person if they get very absorbed in the activity or preoccupied with it. Often that could be a sign of just liking the activity and enjoying it. It does not of itself indicate a problem. And so I think there's been a tendency to over-pathologise gaming. I think there are certainly cases where young people do develop problems, but I think it's very easy to over-pathologise gaming. We've seen studies where 25%, 30% of young people in samples have been classified as having internet gaming disorder. We just don't believe those figures or think they're accurate. And often we find when we look at the measures, they've classified fairly healthy everyday behaviours as being symptomatic of a problem. The true figure in a general population is probably more like about 1 or 2%, who actually experience behaviours to the level that they cause significant harm.
Yeah, that was really a very significant factor for young SM when we went through his conceptualisation about what healthy internet use was and in the value he derived from it in terms of using it for entertainment, for socialisation, for his homework, for research. All of these functions are really valuable pro-social functions, and yet his parents' conceptualisation sort of coming from a generation of people sort of pre-internet, I guess, and they were just very concerned with the amount of time he was spending plugged into a computer. And, I remember when I was growing up, my father sort of admonishing me for sitting in front of the idiot box for too long and watching movies on television. And I think there's that generational kind of disconnect between that understanding. Do you think that in this particular case too, I mean, it was the parents' response to that sort of perception that really led to the significant psychological act of him trying to take his own life, and that really escalated the negative pathology. And so, yeah, I think it's a good message for parents to stop and think about these things before they react.
There's certainly a number of cases in the clinical literature where taking away gaming devices have led to very violent or suicide that has occurred in a number of cases. There have even been several cases where, school-related violence has been precipitated by the parents taking away devices. Some of them are publicised cases in America have involved those sorts of situations. And it's certainly the case that media perceptions and parents' perceptions of technology and its effects doesn't always coincide with the actual experience of technology by young people. And I think as you raise a very valid point, that every generation has concerns about the new activities young people are engaging in because they're very different. They seem to take them away from activities that they thought were very normal in that same sort of period of life. And so just as we're having concerns about internet use now, social media use, there was concern about excessive television watching back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Back in the 1930s, it was all about young people up in their tree houses reading all these violent pulp comics. And even going back further than that, there was concern about, penny dreadfuls, being sold under the counter in London. Every era has its sort of new concern, whether it's to do with music, film, technology, which is raised. For me, I think things are a little bit different now in that media is so saturated. I think that the social media world is certainly one which does have, where you could raise some legitimate concerns. I think I often feel sometimes that when we talk about internet game disorder, one of the problems is that are we talking about internet disorder, activities you're playing through the internet, or is the internet itself the problem? And social media related problems, which can be almost addictive as well, they are activities which really only exist on the internet. And so I don't want to raise more concerns about excessive social media use, I think, than gaming. But I would say that those two activities are very much now intertwined. So people will actually watch Twitch channels watching actual live gaming and actually picking up comments. You can always do pseudo gambling activities in those as well. So social media itself, I think, is as much a concern as I think internet gaming disorder when we talk about the general category of internet use as being excessive behaviour.
Yes, and I think that one of the important things from a therapeutic perspective was the re-engagement with his family, and the family's role in developing a better understanding was a very important part of his progress through therapy as well too. So I think sometimes it's very important to engage with the families as well and not just sort of focus on evidence-based treatment for depression, let's say, without ignoring the sort of social context and things as well. I guess the other interesting point you raised about the adolescence and the sort of intensified emotional responses to social media is certainly something we see a lot at PsychMed and through the program. So, yeah, thanks very much, Paula. I hope that'll be helpful for parents and healthcare professionals who are reviewing this issue and wondering how they can respond. I'd also point out that we did a research project for the Wellbeing and Recovery Research Institute where we canvassed schools throughout South Australia and teachers to identify their concerns with children who had excessive amounts of time engaged in gaming, and also parents. And we held a forum, which I believe you took part in as well, which produced some advice and tips for parents and teachers, which will be also available on our website. So thank you very much, Professor Del Fabro and Patrick Kerry and everyone else that's participated. As I mentioned, all of these podcasts will be available through our social media and through the Wellbeing and Recovery Research Institute as part of Gambling Harm 2020, what's formerly known as Gambling Harm Awareness Week, which has sort of transitioned into Gambling Harm Awareness Month. And we hope these podcasts have been helpful.
Thank you, Quinton. And thank you, Patrick and Paul, for donating your time today. I'm sure this will be a valuable resource for friends and families of those who they might feel this person might have a gaming or gambling difficulty in their life, and especially for healthcare providers who have tuned in today. Tune in next week for our podcast number 4 of Gambling Harm Awareness Week, which will talk about the harms experienced by hospitality workers and how we can monitor and help support them and to promote resilience and well-being.